Hello, all, and welcome. We are back talking about innovations in competency mapped corporate training. In our last episode, we focused on corporate learning and development and continued the discussion on how to scale a competency based model. Moving on, in this episode, we continue the discussion on scaling and go over how learning strategy and needs assessments are foundational to scaling. Today, we have two guests, Dr. Guido Minaya, CEO and Chief Learning Officer of Minaya Learning Global Solutions, and also Susan Minaya, COO and Chief Learning Strategist at Minaya Learning Global Solutions. Susan is also an award-winning instructional design and learning strategy expert. Stay tuned to learn more. Hello, Dr. Minaya and Susan. I think we're going to have a lively conversation today. Dr. Minaya, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dario. It is great to be back on with you, and I am so glad Susan can join us today as well. Hello, Susan.
Hello, Guido and Dario. I'm glad to join in on the conversation today.
Well, we are continuing our conversation on innovations that help companies scale skill development through competency mapped models. And we hear how higher ed is moving toward competency-based education, and that is a very good thing from a business perspective. We need new employees with as many entry-level skills as possible to hit the ground running when they enter the workforce.
Yes, that is a good thing.
The corporate world moves at a fast pace, as we know, when it comes to changing technologies, enhancing or adding services as companies adapt to the needs of the marketplace. On today's episode, I want to convey to our listeners how this works internally within corporate learning and development teams. So let's start with some of the basics. Susan, from your perspective, how important is a needs assessment and what does that entail?
Well, the needs assessment is really critical to determine that the right solution is being developed to address the performance expectations, right? So that you're going to really help build that competency or that capability. And really, the needs analysis should answer the question, is training really the right intervention, or might there be another intervention to achieve the performance result? So having a performance consultative lens during the needs assessment requires really looking at the performance impact from three lenses: the work, the worker, and the workplace. And we could go deep here, but generally speaking, for the work, it's like looking at what is the job, what tools and resources are required, what competencies and skills are necessary to be effective in the role, and at what standard level of performance. For the worker, we might be looking at how are they performing in the role against standard levels of performance now, right? So what are the data elements that we're going to look at? And what incentives are there relative to the role that we may be incenting the wrong behaviors potentially that are impacting the performance challenge? So for the workplace, we're looking at the working environment, right? So what is the performance management process and how effectively is it used? And really, I find personally that this is a huge area where many companies try to train their way through employee performance problems when it's really more about the leader being effective at performance management. So that's kind of an area where you want to really kind of take a pause and really evaluate what is that surrounding system. And really the incentives come in here too. Like what kind of incentive structures are we employing to be driving the right kind of performance? And then, is the work environment conducive to support performance results? For example, if you're working from home and the kids are in the background, is that really the best environment to be having that done? And then are the resources available for them to actually support their performance while they're in the role? So these are kind of three big buckets that I think when you're doing a needs assessment that you're really focusing the work on.
Great. Well, thank you, Susan. I think the way you've positioned it, the work, the worker, and the workplace is most helpful. And so as we're working through a needs assessment, how are competencies factored into a needs assessment?
Well, the competencies would be factored into the needs assessment really by looking at the work. So looking at job profiles, required competencies and skills for the role, levels of education, et cetera. I really believe that, many companies can improve their job descriptions to kind of help identify what are the inputs and the outputs of the role, what is really required for the individual to perform well in the role, and what competencies do they need, and what skills are required. A lot of times you'll see job descriptions with just like a laundry list of things to do, but it's not really structured in a way that if I'm the hiring manager, that I'm able to really kind of distill down, does this person have like the skills and the competencies that I need to do the work, all that work that I have in my laundry list, right? So, And I really truly believe that there's degrees of competencies that should be defined. This level of competency gradient, I like to call it, helps employees know where they are on the performance scale for a given competency and what they might need to improve. So you can imagine if you just say they have to have great communication skills, what do we mean by that? Like, how do you define basic level, mid level, or like, high performing level of competency skills. So you have to give people kind of targets for what we're trying to get them to achieve. And I think performance generalities and job descriptions, like I talked about, really make it difficult to kind of see where does the organization lie in a given competency and capability. Some people I have to call this out because some people use the word competency and some capability. And so I kind of view those things as really one and the same. And how to tweak the performance needle to improve overall performance really kind of points back to their ability to differentiate, if you will, the competency performance.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That helps clarify. And for larger initiatives that may be transformational in nature, a learning strategy is a good way to start. What has your experience been with learning strategy?
Well, for learning strategies, I think there's different types of learning strategies first. So there's those that are focused on broad and culturally impacting things in an organization, such as leadership development at all levels, or can be really focused on a specific area of the organization, such as sales or customer service. And I would say that done well, learning strategies really are providing a clear roadmap to guide what needs to be done to achieve the goal. Usually you're not doing learning strategies at kind of we're going to train on this compliance piece. You're not going to have a learning strategy about that per se. But when you're looking at kind of high stakes organizational impacts in one way or another, a strategy may be appropriate for that.
And I think these two foundational steps are key when it comes to scaling a new skill that is required, right? If you're a large organization with multiple locations, different parts of the country or different countries, different continents. When we look at that kind of scaling, what kind of timeframes or project timelines do you encounter when you're asked to help a company move quickly? And I mean from start to finish, from like the initial ask to the deployment of a course or curriculum.
Well, wow, that's a really loaded question. So, and my answer is it depends, right? So I think for large scale transformative work, you're talking about on a global scale. The analysis and the learning strategy component, the analysis part of the strategy work could be anywhere from like 2 to 4 months. And it's really going to depend on the type of analysis approaches that you're undertaking. Are you doing surveys? Are you conducting focus groups? Are you having interviews? These things take time. And so you can't rush through that. And not only does it take time to actually do those things, it takes time to get agreement and buy-in from the organizational leaders that they want to do it, that they're happy with the language and the questions that you're asking or what you're doing. So that's why it kind of extends out. And in some cases, it could be even longer than that. But then, after that, there's still, once we have the recommendations, there's still the build out of those recommendations. And I think depending on how big the kind of the training and development initiative is that you're doing. So these things take time. Then there's the build out of the recommendations that may be another 3 months or even longer, especially if you're talking about language translation or localization. And then, of course, there's a deployment. So not everything, as I mentioned earlier, needs a full-blown learning strategy, when an analysis will do. So if you're basing the analysis on data reviews, for example, and job observations, these things can be done very quickly, maybe like 2 weeks or, maybe a month at the outside to really identify the needs and the solution recommendation for your internal client. And so then, again, there's the build time on top of that and then the deployment time. So am I doing a 1 hour e-learning? Am I doing a 9-month training program? So there's different degrees and different levels of effort that go into that.
Sure. That's understandable. And when it comes to scaling competencies and tracking the progress of learners, in your experience, what tools have you seen used to accelerate this process?
Well, I think foundationally speaking, any analysis and strategy should have defined in it the actual performance metrics that you're going to use to measure the effectivity or the change in performance that you're looking for. So these, if we forget about how to measure success until after we actually deploy or when we're midstream of building content, it's going to be really difficult to get your arms around that. And let alone, I think it's irresponsible for a learning organization not to have that figured out up front. And so, things that you could do is leveraging Kirkpatrick or Phillips's evaluation models. They work really well, so some people like one, some people like another. So take your pick, but if you're planning on doing a return on investment type of initiative for something that you're investing in here from a strategic standpoint, you definitely want to know what's going into the metrics that you're going to be capturing, because it's to do an ROI is a lot to track and manage and put together. And so some of that is easily obtained, and some of it, simple calculations, and other pieces of it are things you have to work a little harder for. But I think leveraging the capabilities from tool standpoint, LMSs. So they're going to tell you, did people in the organization take the training? If we're trying to get everyone to do things differently, did everybody take the training that talks about the why, what we want to do, that type of thing. And the completion rates of how many people in the organization have actually taken that to know that, okay, we've deployed, people have been exposed and trained on it. Now, how are we seeing performance change, And then I think following up with surveys post-training and at interval levels at the employee and leader level are good ways to really get a quantitative and qualitative input to kind of see how you're moving the needle organizationally. Because sometimes it's just performance and sometimes it's perception. You've got customer surveys, that are really, I think, good data points, And then there are performance data points that the business or HR systems can provide, So this is where collaboration becomes so important. We have, on the competency that we're doing here in really growing the organization. So we're looking at sales results. We're looking at how many people got promoted after this, or how many, what were the employee engagement survey results? Did we move the needle on leaders' competency for really, sharing a vision or getting alignment, And, what about reduction in EEO and legal concerns for the organization, which most companies don't like to talk about, but sometimes those are real problems that you're trying to solve. And then what are you trying to achieve really dictates the data points that you use. And from a tools perspective, the user experience platforms such as EngageSim, which I know we've talked about before, that provides really a solid method for not only training, but measuring the results of the individual, the team, the department, division, regional, or even organizational level. And that's done real time. As soon as that assessment is done, bam, the results are there. And I think in a very user-friendly views that make sense for the people that are leveraging the reports and things to see what are the outcomes in the areas of opportunity.
Wow. Well, thank you, Susan. We learned so much today. Thank you for sharing your expertise. This definitely opens the door to even more questions and opportunities to share down the road.
Well, thank you, Guido. I really appreciate talking about this because you know how much I love this. This is a passion topic for me, so thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And I believe we can now move forward to how competency assessment platforms are playing a role in helping companies accelerate and scale skill development. And I really look forward to our next episode. Dario, thanks again for today, and I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Susan and Dr. Minaya, for the great conversation on this topic. In our next episode, we'll look at how to scale a competency-based model through innovative tools and platforms. Until next time.